10th Annual Miller-Upton Forum on the Wealth and Well-Being of Nations. I am Warren Palmer, and I serve as the Albert H. Neese Jr. Professor in Economics, and it's my pleasure to design and direct the Miller-Upton Forum. Tonight, we have the special pleasure of introducing the 10th Miller-Upton Scholar, Michael Greenstone, who will shortly deliver the June B. Martin and Edgar W. Martin Memorial Lecture. But first, let me tell you about the Miller-Upton programs. Dedicated alumni and friends of Miller-Upton funded the Miller-Upton Endowments to honor the 6th president of Beloit College, of the Liberal Society, political freedom, the rule of law, and the promotion of peace and prosperity through the voluntary exchange of goods, services, and ideas. He felt that transforming the ideas of liberal democracy into real institutions was at the heart of increasing the wealth and well-being of nations and peoples. In the audience tonight is Emeritus Professor of Economics Jeff Adams, the original visionary designer of the Miller-Upton programs, and Bill Fitzgerald, who co-chaired the successful fundraising campaign for the Miller-Upton Endowments. Through the Miller-Upton programs, students and faculty engage with these questions central to promoting the wealth and well-being of nations. What drives human progress? Why do some societies prosper while others remain poor? What economic institutions and policies are essential for the good of society? How can I advance the ideas and institutions of a free and prosperous society? How can I make a difference in the fields of business and public policy to create a more prosperous world? The Miller-Upton Endowments supports an endowed chair, the Albert H. Neese Jr. Professor of Economics, the Miller-Upton Forum itself with the Miller-Upton Scholar, the Econ Senior Seminar based on the work of each year's Upton Scholar, publication of the annual Proceedings of the Wealth and Well-Being of Nations, financial support for summer internships for econ majors, the Student Research Colloquium, and the recently launched Miller-Upton Speaker Series. The centerpiece of all these programs is the Miller-Upton Forum. Tonight, our 10th forum concludes with tonight's talk. Each year, one of the world's top scholars is named the Miller-Upton Scholar and visits campus for a multi-day residency called the Miller-Upton Forum. Beginning with the Nobel Prize winner, Douglas North, each Miller-Upton Scholar has significantly contributed to our understanding of the sources of the wealth and well-being of nations. During the forum, we also bring other prominent scholars and practitioners working in the Upton Scholars area of inquiry. Tonight's event culminates 18 months of planning and preparation, intense study by the 38 students in the Econ Senior Seminar, and a week that has already featured a lecture performance, multiple class visits, a faculty forum, 2 panel discussions, and 6 speakers in addition to our Miller-Upton Scholar. It has already been an extraordinary week. We have kept our speakers very busy, and all of them have been generous with their time and energy. Let me thank a few of the people who made this week's events possible. First, let me thank all the students in this senior seminar for working so hard. Thank you to everyone who's participated in this week's events. Particularly thank you to all of you who are in the audience tonight. Your engagement and participation are what make this year's Miller-Upton Forum the exciting experience it is. Finally, special acknowledgement and thank you to Jennifer Kodal, who for 10 years has been the program coordinator of the Miller-Upton programs and the managing editor of the annual Proceedings of the Wealth and Well-Being of Nations. Jennifer's work is never done. On average, at any one time, we are working on 3 forums. In the back, as you leave tonight, please pick up the printed proceedings of last year's Upton Forum, and the announcement card for the 2018 Miller-Upton Forum on Globalization and the Wealth and Well-Being of Nations, with 2018 Miller-Upton Scholar Danny Roderick, the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. But now, let me introduce the theme of this year's Miller-Upton Forum and then tonight's speaker. You may remember that 1 year ago, we listened to the 9th Miller-Upton scholar, Deirdre McCloskey, discuss her trilogy on the bourgeois era, which she calls the Great Enrichment. That burst of unprecedented development in the last 200 years that makes possible our meeting here tonight. As Deirdre reminded us, not too long ago, all of our ancestors lived in terrible poverty and ignorance. And, she said, we should wish and work for the continued advance of a great enrichment to include everyone in the world. Here we are tonight, well-fed, well-clothed, in a delightful, well-lit, climate-controlled building with the leisure to consider issues and ideas of such importance. Surely a testament to the great enrichment. And at the heart of our prosperity and of the great enrichment is energy. I like to tell my students that energy makes giants of us all and illustrate the point with pictures of cars, planes, thermostats, refrigerators, and laptop computers. For each of us in the U.S., we live lives that would be inconceivable just a short time ago. And it is modern commercial energy that powers our lives. Energy gives us tremendous power over our personal environments. But what's wrong with the claim I just made? That energy makes giants of us all? Right. It's the large swaths of humanity that lack access to the economic development and energy resources we have. More than 1 billion people lack access to electricity. More than 3 billion still cook with biomass stoves that create terrible air pollution in their homes. What do these people need? They need economic growth that has enriched our lives, and for that they need access to much more modern commercial energy. The theme of this year's Miller-Upton Forum is energy and the wealth of nations. Yes, indeed, what the poor of the world need is access to inexpensive, reliable commercial energy to cook their meals, to light and heat their homes and schools, to power their villages and towns, to energize their businesses, and to give them access to all the benefits of commercial energy that people in the developed nations take for granted. At the same time, the world needs less pollution and less CO2 from burning fossil fuels. Ending poverty, reducing pollution, and limiting climate change are three of the greatest challenges facing humanity today, and all three are intimately connected to our production and use of commercial energy. Michael Greenstone, this year's Miller-Upton Scholar, has focused his career on this triple challenge. Professor Greenstone, who served as the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, is one of the world's most innovative environmental economists, who, in more than 60 papers, has been changing how we think about these issues. He is the Milton Friedman Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. He is the director of the Energy Policy Institute, the Energy and Environment Lab at the University of Chicago Urban Labs, and the Becker-Friedman Institute for Research in Economics. Please welcome the 2017 Miller-Upton Scholar, Michael Greenstone.
Thanks very much to everyone at Beloit. It's been a tremendous few days. Warren in particular, I don't know if he sleeps, but he's been a wonderful ambassador for the whole college, and it's been terrific to get to know so many of you so well. So what I want to talk about, which Warren has previewed, is what I like to call the Global Energy Challenge, and then I just threw a intensely provocative subtitle here: Will we ever stop using fossil fuels? The picture that is on the screen, I think, helps illustrate, I think, the challenge, the global energy challenge that we face very well, much better than I can do it with my papers. So the picture is a scene in Beijing. It's the middle of the day. You can see our friend on the bike there is moving quickly. The guys in the cars are moving quickly. And it captures what I think are like the three legs of the stool of the global energy challenge. And so the first is just the motion and the action and everything that is going on there in Beijing. And if you've ever been to China in the last couple of decades, you know, it's definitely a country on the make, and you can feel it as soon as you get off the plane there. That all that economic growth that is represented by the motion and action there, you know, it has to be one of the greatest achievements in human history, what has happened in China in the last 25 years or so. They brought literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And all that would not have been possible without access to inexpensive and reliable energy. So that's the first leg of the stool. How do you get access to the inexpensive and reliable sources of energy that are critical for economic growth? The second leg of the stool is also immediately visible there. It's the middle of the day in Beijing. You can't see the sun. It's not a completely uncommon occurrence there. And the reason that you can't see the sun is that the same energy that is powering all this economic growth is largely coming from fossil fuels, and it's producing all that pollution that's hiding the sun. And that pollution is not a secret. Our guy on the bike, has on a mask. He's very aware of it. He has on goggles. It's hard to see. He has on some gloves. And so the second leg of the stool is, how do you contend with the air pollution, which people just don't like because it's unpleasant to look at, but also because it imposes great costs on people's health. And so the second leg of the stool is related to the pollution associated with energy production and consumption. And the third leg of the stool is not as immediately visible, but you know it's there. And that's that the same fossil fuels that are causing this pollution, the visible air pollution, are also involve the release of CO2, and that's increasing the probability of disruptive climate change. And so why I think this is such a terrific area for study and for learning about the world is that trying to find a balance between all three of those goals, preventing disruptive climate change, managing the pollution and health problems associated with energy consumption, and getting access to the inexpensive and reliable energy that's so critical for growth is quite a challenge. It is not hard to think of solutions or policies or ideas that are beneficial on one or two of those dimensions, but it's very difficult to think of ones that hit all three at once. And so inevitably, this challenge involves trade-offs that are going to be based on people's income levels, it's going to be based on their morals, it's going to be based on social custom, and it's in that kind of gray space where I think a lot of the world's most interesting problems live. So I will now talk about, just as a level setting here, 7 facts that I think kind of help explain or illustrate the global energy challenge. And then at the end of that, I'll try and talk about what I think are some solutions, because the 7 facts can sometimes feel a little heavy. So number 1 is energy is critical for growth. So for anyone who works with data, you know that data is an incredibly disappointing partner. I like to joke, we'll see if it works in this room, but I like to joke with my undergrads that if you think back to high school, you know, what was true about your worst boyfriend or girlfriend? Maybe all of you had better dating careers than me, but what was true is that I knew I was going to be disappointed every day, I just didn't quite know how. And so that was like the surprise I lived with each day. This is like an exception to that rule. Like here, data is not disappointing. There's a very clear relationship. And the key thing to take away from it is we really don't have instances of economies achieving high levels of living standards without lots and lots of energy consumption. So that's, I think, a fact on the ground if you think about this global energy challenge. The second fact is that energy access is a major problem, and actually it's one of these cases when you start to look at the numbers, it's a little hard to stop thinking about the numbers. And so if you look around the world, you can see in Canada, they consume about 15,500 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. In the United States, it's maybe 13,000. And then you turn to some other countries that are very populous, and you can see, in China, it's maybe a quarter of the US level. In India, it's a little bit dated, it's probably 1,000 now, but you get the point, it's extraordinarily low. And now I've put on at the bottom of this table is a state where I do a lot of research in India, state of Bihar. It's home now, I think it's a little dated, but its population is probably 120 million people now. And per capita electricity consumption is 122 kilowatt hours per year. So they're off by 2 zeros. And that is not a state of affairs that I think they're very comfortable with or very excited about. And so to have the income growth that I think people around the world want, they're going to want large increases in energy consumption. And so not surprisingly, the third fact is that demand is projected to grow rapidly in developing countries, much less so in developed countries. And so here's just some historical data, going back to 1965, the last 50 years. You can see that total energy consumption per capita, this is including transport and power and everything, per capita has basically been flat in the United States and Canada for the last 40 years. And then at the bottom of the figure, you can see China was flat for a long time, and then as economic growth starts to take off, you can see the energy line start to go up. And if you squint, you can begin to see an upturn in India. And so that's the last 50 years. What are the standard projections for what's going to come in the next several decades? Well, there'll be basically no growth in energy consumption in OECD countries, and really quite strong and robust growth, maybe almost a doubling between now and 2035. And that's going to come in places like Bihar, and that's going to come in places, the other parts of India and the other parts of China. Okay, so that's fine. Energy is critical for growth. There's lots of energy access problems, and standard projections have that some of that will be solved in the coming decades, and it's going to be coming through increased energy consumption in poor countries. Today's poor countries, how are they going to get that energy? Where's it going to come from? Fact 4 is that all of the standard models, all the standard projections have that it's going to come from fossil fuels. And yes, okay, so what is striking is when one reads about changes in the energy system, you hear a lot about installed solar capacity and the rapid growth in wind and solar, but when you add it all up, the standard models are that the data are in 2014, 81% of energy consumption came from fossil fuels, and the standard projections are that by 2040, that number will not have changed, that fraction will not have changed very much. It'll still be 74%. And so you might ask, well, why is that? And it's really because fossil fuels, although they have these negative, unintended, or undesirable consequences of air pollution and CO2, were quite remarkable invention, and quite capable of producing the energy at very low cost. And so on this chart here, I'm reporting what it costs per kilowatt hour to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity from different sources. And just what I want you to take away, and this is from the US and it will vary from country to country, but what I want you to take away from it is how inexpensive the fossil fuels are. An existing coal plant can probably produce a kilowatt hour of electricity for about 3 cents. A new natural gas plant in the US with a low natural gas price is probably 5.5 cents. A new coal plant that had all the required environmental controls in the US would probably be 8 cents. And then when you get to the low carbon or low pollution sources, you can see that the cost is maybe 2 or 3 times as much. And so the only point is it's not accidental that the fossil fuels are projected to be the primary source. It's that the economics, as we have currently constructed energy markets, and I'm going to come back to that, are pushing people to choose the fossil fuels. This isn't true only in the power sector. I also have made this figure here, which is a little complicated, so let me try and talk through it. On the horizontal axis, I've got the cost of batteries, and on the y-axis, we have the price of oil. What the figure is trying to do is take the lifetime cost of owning an electric vehicle versus owning an internal combustion engine vehicle. And you'll see along the red line, that's the equal cost line. So at that point, it doesn't cost any more to own an electric vehicle, EV, rather than internal combustion engine. And if you're below the line, then the internal combustion engine, because gas prices are going down, then the internal combustion engine is cheaper, and if you're above it, then the electric vehicles are cheaper. So now I'm just going to highlight a couple points along that, probably not all of which you can read at the back of the room, but what you can read off of this are the pairs of battery prices and gasoline or petroleum prices per barrel of oil, where it's equal cost over the lifetime. And so we were just talking about this at dinner, and I verified my number with Chuck McQuaid that Tesla Powerwall, not including installation, according to Chuck, is $390 per kilowatt hour. So what would be the price of oil that would make it equal cost? And this is setting aside range anxiety, this is setting aside replacing the battery. Well, the answer is like $540 per barrel of oil. So now, some people in the room actually must know the oil markets, but for the people who don't know that, can volunteer what the price of a barrel of oil is currently? $55, $53. 10%. Yeah. So, what are some, oh, all right, so we lost some, oh no, here's some other ones. So, you know, if the batteries came down to $264, which the DOE projects could be the case by 2020, would be a pretty sharp decline from current prices. You would need a break-even price of oil of 310. If they came down to 125, you would need a break-even price of oil of about 115. And if you had the futures price of oil in 2020, which is projected to be $50, then the batteries would have to come down to 60. So the only point to take away from this is the same point in the power sector, which is that the economics of energy markets as currently constructed, and I will keep coming back to that, point to using the fossil fuel. So it's not surprising that IEA and every other organization has the world continuing to be heavily reliant on fossil fuels. It's not just that fossil fuels are cheap, they're also incredibly abundant. And there's a lot of different ways to illustrate this, but this is one of my favorite. So this is the ratio of fossil fuel reserves to production year by year. So in 1980, we had what looked like about 35 years of production available to us. And had we, this is sounds like a trick question, it's not, but had we not discovered any more oil, what would be true in 2015? We would be out of oil, right? We had 35 years. What's striking is that actually we started to consume oil at a higher rate than we did in 1980, and now there's like 55 years of oil available. And so how's that possible? Well, that's possible because the guys at Schlumberger and the guys at Exxon and Chesapeake and all the various oil and gas companies are really, really good at what they do. And they're continually innovating, and they're continually finding ways to get access to fossil fuels that are inexpensive. So fossil fuels are, maybe the way to say it is, I think we're in no time, we're nowhere near running out of fossil fuels. This is also true for natural gas. The coal line looks like we only have 100 years left. There's something wrong with that data. There's more coal than you can shake a stick at, I think, as my dad used to say. So the main point is that there's lots and lots of fossil fuels, and they're really inexpensive. Okay, so that's fine. Fossil fuels are just a source of energy. Or is it not fine? And the reason it might not be fine is that fossil fuels come bundled, if they're not controlled, with pollution. And that pollution shortens lives. And so I'm going to talk to you, or briefly describe a paper that I just published a few weeks ago with some co-authors that tries to estimate the impact of air pollution on life expectancy, sustained exposure to air pollution on life expectancy. So it's, thankfully no society is ever going to allow some wild economist to run a randomized control trial of exposure to ambient air pollution over someone's lifetime. So that kind of left researchers scratching around for trying to find a setting where you might be able to understand or infer or estimate the effect of long-run exposure to air pollution. And so what this paper does is it exploits a very arbitrary and maybe even capricious policy that China implemented in the planning period, between 1950 and 1980, that mimics many of the features of a randomized control trial. So in particular, during this period, there was not enough money to provide winter heating for people in China. And so they came up with a rule, and that rule was they drew a line across the middle of the country and said, if you live north of that line, we're going to build you boilers, and we're going to give you free coal between roughly November 15th and March 15th every year. And indeed, the legacy of that policy lives on. And not just that, if you live south of the line, you're not allowed to have winter heating. And so I lectured at a university in Chengdu, which is in the northern part of the south, so they have cold winters, and all the students are wearing winter coats. It's just a fact of life that there's not heating. So anyway, the idea of the paper is, well, maybe we could compare people who live just to the north versus just to the south, and see if they were exposed to different levels of air pollution, and then if that's the case, assess whether or not what happened to their life expectancy. And importantly, not entirely in the period that I'm going to study, but most of the period I'm studying, their migration was highly restricted. And so there weren't opportunities for people to move around, and so you have something that approximates what might have been an experiment. So here's a picture in the north. You can see the heating is not provided by big efficient power stations located away from the city center. These are attached to individual apartment buildings, and there's no real pollution controls on them. Here's our line. It follows the Huai River until the Huai River kind of peters out, and then it follows a mountain range over there. And here's Chengdu, which is a city in the northern part of the south. And so again, the idea of this is we want to compare places just to the north versus places just to the south. And the paper essentially boils down to two pictures. The first picture is this picture. And here, the line, the gap between the red and the blue dots is the Huai River line. And then as you move to the right of that, each circle represents the pollution concentration in 1 degree latitude bins. So everyone who lives within 1 degree latitude north of the river, and then 1 to 2, and 2 to 3, and then the same thing going south. Those are the blue dots. The dots are proportional to the number of people who live in those places. And what you can see, it's striking, is that there's a jump in the level of pollution right at the river. And that jump is actually quite significant. It's about 40 micrograms per cubic meter of PM10. It's about a 40 or 50% increase relative to living just to the south of the river. It's interesting, you could also test, you could make fake Huai rivers, and there's no jump at any other displacement. It's only happening right where the river is. And so this was the first main result of the paper. The second one is to ask, well, is there a change in life expectancy right at the river's edge? And here too, this is another example of data conforming, I guess we would say, and there's a very sharp decline in life expectancy that occurs right as you live to the north, right as you live to the north. It's interesting, the data from China are actually very good, and so there's information on cause of death and the elevated rates of mortality that are leading to these lower levels of life expectancy are all running to cardiorespiratory causes of death. And it seems, which I guess, at least in my mind, helps build a case for this being plausibly related to air pollution. So, let me zoom out here of this little paper on China and now say, well, what does this look like around the world in terms of losses of life expectancy? So this is something that I've made up with some of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, which is an air quality life index. And here we've colored the world based on the gain in life expectancy that's feasible if each part of the world became moved into compliance with the World Health Organization standards for PM 2.5. And you can see that the air pollution problem is largely a developing country problem. Almost all of China, these are like 4 years or 3.5 years, 5 years loss of life expectancy. Remember, this is multiplied by the 1.4 billion people who live in China. In India, there's a similar loss of life expectancy. You can see in the United States, this looks very different than it did in the 1970s. There's been remarkable progress on air pollution in the United States. There are still some areas where there are modest declines. You can see where we are in the Chicago area. There's still some pollution, although it's probably reducing all of our life expectancy more by 1 year rather than 4 years. And maybe also in the Los Angeles area. Okay. All right, so that's one undesirable feature of fossil fuels. Another undesirable feature is that fossil fuels are causing climate change, and I could never really figure out how to finish this, so this kind of peters off, and the consequences are complicated. So I'll try and explain that as we go along here. So first, just to level set, I think I have always had a hard, well, I've never really been able to figure out Fahrenheit versus Celsius. And so I always find when the climate scientists say the global mean temperature is going to go up by 2 degrees Celsius, it doesn't really mean very much to me. So what I've done here is plot the distribution of average daily temperatures in India in Fahrenheit, which they do not actually use in India, but that's for my benefit. And you can see that the average Indian has maybe 60 days a year where it's between 79 and 81. This is the average, it's the average of the high and the low. And then there's a couple days where it's greater than 90. Remember 90, when that's the average, is very, very hot, since it's the average of the high and low. That's the current distribution. What would it look like if we didn't have any global climate policy in 2100? Well, you'd have this enormous piling up of days at the very hot ranges of temperatures. The number of days greater than 97 would go from 2 or 3 up to about 15. And you can see the next few categories have similar, if not larger increases. The reason I think that's an easier and better way than understanding 2 degrees change in mean global temperatures is the relationship between human well-being and temperature is really dependent on what happens at the extremes. And so a lot of the bad stuff, the elevated rates of mortality, the crop problems, etc., they're all coming from these days. Okay, so I'm going to just, again, dive you into a paper for a couple minutes that tries to, which Kelsey talked about earlier today, and one day we will finish it and submit it to a journal. And it's about trying to project what the impacts of climate change will be on mortality. So here's the first thing. This is, and let's just get a level set here. This is the estimated effect of temperature on mortality in the United States. And the way to read this is, if you took a day in the 70 to 74 range and moved it to any of these other categories, what would happen to the annual mortality rate? And actually, you can see you have to go to an extra decimal place to actually see it. But the key thing is that there is a little bit of a relationship. The hot days seem to be cause some increase in mortality. Now, it's going to look like I'm tricking you, but all I'm doing is I'm expanding the y-axis here. That blue line is the same as this blue line. I just expanded the y-axis. And so now it's not very easy to see. You can see that little bump on the hot days. Now the reason I expanded that is because I want to show you what the impact of temperature and mortality is going to be in India. And it's not going to be covered in this shortened y-axis here. So now let's add it. And what you can see is that there's the impact of an extra day, let's say, in the greater than 95 range, is to increase the annual, not the daily, the annual mortality rate about 25 times larger than it is in the United States. So the point is, the very same countries that are looking for a lot more energy, that appear poised to use lots of fossil fuels, and are in a tough position with respect to air pollution, are also quite vulnerable to climate change. But what I want you to think about is, well, there's two. If you're in India, the red line is a terrible way to live. The red line is, you're sick, die too early, your children die, and you really want to get on the blue line. And the blue line is just a much easier lifestyle. This is a beautiful building with climate control, and that's what the blue line is. The red line is something else. And that is what's driving the desire for so much more energy and the desire for economic growth. And you can then begin to see that the trade-offs inherent in the global energy challenge. It's not that India is unaware that using a lot more energy will increase the likelihood of disruptive climate change. It's that they have a very painful trade-off between today and tomorrow. And the rest of the world, in one way or another, is depending, or is going to be affected by the choices that India makes. So let's just take a look at this on what I think helps underscore some of these points I'm making. This is the share of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. It's cumulative. It's not a given year. It's since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see the United States has accounts for about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. India is at about 4%, and China is at about 12%. What's projected, it's missing the year, but what's projected by 2050? Well, the U.S. share is projected to go down. China's share is expected to shoot straight up, and India's is projected to go up. And if you go out to 2100, that's even more so. You can see by then the U.S.'s cumulative share is actually quite small. It's maybe down to 12%. China's about a quarter, and India's about 9%. And so what does that mean? That means that to address climate change in one way or another, there has to be a reduction in CO2 emissions relative to what's projected in the very countries that are desperate for more energy, and when facing currently, the energy market is currently constructed, are going to feel like the fossil fuels are the way to go. And at some level, the whole world is going to be dependent on the choices they make. Just for almost a sidebar, well, suppose we really did use all the fossil fuels. There's an incredible amount laying around in the ground. If you added this all up, you'd be at maybe like 16 degrees Fahrenheit, thankfully, of potential warming. So again, as I was making this point earlier, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels anytime at any time scale that matters for climate change. Okay, so that's my wife accuses me of this being a song dark speech, so now we're going to start to cue maybe the lighter part. So the Paris agreement is expected to help some, and it's maybe worth talking about that. The red line is what was projected, or what's projected globally. This is emissions of CO2 out to 2100, which would, if that happened, the climate models say there'd be about a 4.5 degree C or 8 degree Fahrenheit temperature increase. The green line is what the scientists say we should be doing in terms of emissions, and that would keep us to about 2 degrees C or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the blue line is probably somewhere in between, and if you want to think about the Paris Agreement, you can think of it, I think this graph perfectly helps illustrate this, you can think of it as half full or half empty. And the Paris Agreement only goes out to 2030, but you can see it starts to move you off the red line, and at least sets the stage. Now the Paris Agreement is voluntary, and there's lots of issues with it. Certainly one of them is that I think our commitment to it is a little bit less than it was when we signed it, and so it's a little difficult to know whether or not we're really going to find the blue line, but that's kind of where we are globally with that. Okay, so those are the 7 facts. Now, with the uplifting 7 facts, let's talk about why I think actually there are completely feasible solutions out there to be had that may not be, we can all debate how politically feasible they are, but they are certainly, maybe let me put it a different way. In some respects, the global energy challenge is actually kind of a boring economics problem. The answer to what to do about this is not, doesn't require rocket science to understand it. And I'm going to talk through what can be done. Unfortunately, I'm unaware of any economist who has been elected president of anything besides possibly an economics association. And, sorry? President of Peru. President of Peru. So politicians don't always follow what the economists want, maybe that, except in Peru. Okay, so the first thing is to just price energy at its full social cost. So the reason there's all that CO2 and the reason there's all that air pollution is that when you go to the gas station, when guys go to the gas station in India, they don't face the prices associated with the damages that come from using that. In fact, we talked about a little bit about this earlier today. Actually, there is often policy that distorts energy prices. It usually just, more often than not, distorts it in the wrong way. It makes the fossil fuels cheaper than they should be. So one obvious solution is to price energy at its full cost, and doing so has a great potential to disrupt energy markets in a way that would both unleash innovation, but also just cause people to make different choices. So let's just take a look at this. This is, I turned the graph we looked at earlier on its side. This is a levelized cost for a new plant in 2023. What would it cost to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity? We saw earlier the combined cycle natural gas plant is the winner at about 5.3 cents. You can see the nuclear plant, this is why no one is building nuclear plants. They're about twice as expensive as that. And even a coal plant built with all kinds of environmental controls is still more expensive than combined cycle, cheaper than nuclear though. What happens if we had a charge just for carbon, never mind the particulates air pollution part? This is one charge, this is about $40 a ton. You could think of larger ones, and it's unclear at this point exactly what the science merits. It would still lead to choosing a combined cycle plant, but coal would be completely out of the picture. In parts of the world where there's not such bountiful natural gas, things like nuclear would suddenly start to look like a feasible option in a way that it, or not just feasible, but an economic option in a way that it doesn't currently. It's also worth just briefly talking about why wind and solar and hydro still look like they're kind of out of the money, and why they actually have those green bars on there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the challenges with those technologies is that they're very intermittent. And so when they are not operating, you have to have something to fill in the gaps. And so what I've built here are renewable plants with natural gas backup, which is the most standard way to handle it. And that's why when you have a carbon charge, it would actually start to increase the cost of those technologies. Okay, here I've introduced the other charge for air pollution. And then you can see coal would be way, way out of the money. Okay, so what is the right price that is, I think, a question that's open for exciting area for research. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing on trying to figure out what that price is. And so before I do that, I just want to highlight why is it so important to know what the costs of the release of an additional ton of CO2 are. And the costs of an additional ton of CO2 emissions are often referred to the social cost of carbon. And up until maybe 2 weeks ago, the US social cost of carbon was $42 a ton. And what I've arrayed on this graph is the reason it's so important to have some marker for what the damages are is that gives you a bright line for the policies that are actually beneficial for society and the policies that are undesirable or net negative. And so if something costs more, if the social cost of carbon is truly $42 and we're implementing a policy that costs $600 a ton, that's a bad deal. You know, it costs more than the benefits it's providing. And so what I've lined up here are the cost per ton abated from several kind of popular energy programs. Here's one for an appliance upgrade. This one is for rebate for reducing electricity use from the distribution company, rebates for efficient vehicles, and this is for residential energy efficiency. And what I just want you to see is we are not pursuing, by and large, the kind of carbon pricing that economists love to talk about, and instead we're pursuing policies that cost $600, $470, $300, or $200 per ton abated. And the reason we know that's expensive is because they vastly exceed the benefits that we're getting from that, which are the $42 a ton. Now, just as a basis of comparison, there are parts of the world that do have cap and trade programs or market prices for carbon, and I just plotted on here, you know, the cost per ton from the carbon market in New England, from the European Union, and from California, and you can see that they're all much lower than from these other programs. And so effectively, we are doing the mental jiu-jitsu of choosing programs that cost $600 a ton, when instead we could choose programs that cost, you know, $10 or $15 a ton, and making it 40 times as expensive as it needs to be to get reductions. Now, having said that, you know, there are some places in the world where carbon is priced. In fact, the share of global emissions where its price was basically zero until 2003, and now it's up to about 13%. There's wide variability in the price across the world. Most of the places where it's priced, it's way below I think what the U.S. government social cost of carbon was of $42. And, you know, I think the average price should be on there, but the average price is maybe, you know, like $8 or $9. So there's a lot of room for expanding pricing carbon programs in the 87% of the world where it's not priced, and in the many parts of the world where it's priced too low. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about this briefly, but, you know, how do we measure damages today? We rely on three main models. These are graphs of the damage functions associated with global mean temperature rises of which reported on the x-axis in 2100, and you can see, you know, at low levels of temperature increase, there's not projected to be very much damages, but at the higher levels, you can have quite substantial. This is the share of global GDP. However, there's been great dissatisfaction with these models, and here's a quote from Nick Stern, kind of underscoring some of that dissatisfaction. My former colleague Bob Pindyke, who's a little bit more of a bomb thrower, has this kind of incendiary quote, which I kind of agree with the substance, but maybe not all of the articulation of Bob. So what is being done? I'm helping to lead a group with three colleagues called the Climate Impact Lab, where we're trying to take a new look at this and estimate, based on data, not kind of aggregated intuition, what the impacts of climate change will be in a variety of sectors. and then add that up to produce an overall estimate of the social cost of carbon. Here's an example of the parts of the world where we've been able to collect mortality data. We'll just take a lot of really interesting things have emerged from this. You can see that the relationship between temperature and mortality is much sharper for people over 65 and the young than it is for age 5 to 64. Our initial work in using data from around the world notably has found that the damages associated just from mortality, not from any of the other sectors, are about the same size of magnitude as what the 3 existing damage functions suggest. So let me say that again and translate it in English. We're finding that the projected costs of climate change just on mortality, never mind all the other ways in which climate change might affect human well-being, are about as large as what the 3 main existing models that people have relied on. And so we're working to fill that in for the other sectors, agricultural production and crime and labor productivity and energy demand. But to a first pass, this new empirical approach appears to be suggesting that we have been systematically understating the cost of climate change. Here's some preliminary results from a bunch of other sectors. And this is what I was talking about. There's these very nonlinear relationships, be it labor supply, electricity demand, corn yields, all of which suggest that it's really these hot days that are the problems for human well-being. And so I'll just turn back, how we feel about these policies. I don't think there's a plausible social cost of carbon that's ever going to make us think $600 per ton is a good idea. But it's very possible that that line would move around as we learn more. Okay, so number 1 is let's embed in prices both the air pollution and the carbon damages, and that should be true both in the United States and other parts of the world, certainly including India and China, and that will allow everyone around the world to make better choices. And currently, it's not that you escape those costs. That's one point I wanted to make is by not putting it in the price of energy, it's not like you can escape the cost. You're just paying for it in a different way and in a less effective way with shorter lives and disruptive climate change. So I think the other main solution is to invest in innovation. And I think I'm going to just try and illustrate 2 areas where I think there's opportunities for lots of investment innovation. The first is policy innovation. One challenge is that a lot of today's developing countries kind of have weak institutions. And so even in the cases where there are very strict environmental laws on the books, they have had difficulty enforcing them. So, in 2017, China inspected 20,000 businesses across 20 cities in northern China. Nearly 70% of those businesses were failing to meet Chinese standards. In India, this is a picture of a place where I've done some research. They have some very similar problems. Now, what's surprising, and I'm going to tell you about some work that I've done in the state of Gujarat, is that in a lot of cases, the insidious underbelly of economics is the insidious underbelly of all of this. And what do I mean by that? That you could reform markets in ways, in this case inspection markets or auditing markets, that would produce better outcomes than are evident there. So in the case of India, with some colleagues, we set out to examine why a major form of environmental inspection was not working out very well there. In practice, they have, in the state of Gujarat, they have 2 ways that they inspect plants. The first is they have government employees go and take readings, and if the plant is in violation, then they can be penalized. The second thing that they do is they have something called a third-party audit market. And that's a requirement that plants hire a consultancy to come take readings, send them to the regulator, and then if the readings are out of compliance, then the plant could be fined. Now, when we start to make contact with these guys, they were thinking of ending the third-party auditing program. They said, you know, we thought this was a great idea, but we look out the window and we see that, and then the reports we're getting from the auditors say all the plants are in compliance, so we don't really think this is working out very well. And we said, okay, well, you know, tell us a little bit about how this is working. And they said, well, it's a requirement that the consulting company send in a report. And I said, oh, well, you know, well, who hires the consulting company? They say, oh, you know, the plant picks the consulting company, and then the plant pays the consulting company. And so then we went and, you know, drove and talked to some of the consulting companies, and they said, you know, it's very clear, if you were to ever report anyone that's been out of compliance, that would be your last day as a third-party auditor in Gujarat. So we came up with the idea of breaking what was an obvious conflict of interest, and the way we tried to break it was we ran a real experiment where we divided plants with the regulator hand in hand into a treatment group and a control group, and in the treatment group, they were no longer allowed to pick the auditor, they were no longer allowed to pay the auditor, they had to pay to a central pool, and the central pool paid the auditor, and then we gave bonuses to the auditors if their readings matched our readings. So it appeared that they had reliable readings. So I know we're running short on time, but I can't resist showing this, a couple more figures here. So this is the distribution of readings for suspended particulate matter. The red line is the compliance standard. And you can see that almost all of the plants are to the left of the line, or reported by the auditors as being below the standard. And then there's a couple of plants who are reported as having pollution emissions that are above the standard. And this was in the control group for the status quo. Now, what I'm going to show you is what the truth was, because we had an opportunity to go look at those plants. And you can see that what the auditor is reporting in no way matches what the truth. There were about 60% of the plants that were above the standard. My favorite part of this, I can't quite reach, are those guys way down there at the low levels of pollution. And so it turns out like those were plants that were barely operating and not emitting much pollution, but the auditors were scared to report that, or some of them probably weren't even taking readings, and just said, well, you know, it'd be better to report everyone right below the standard. Okay, so that's the status quo. So what happened in the treatment group? Well, here's what the auditors reported. You can see they reported a much more dispersed distribution of pollution. Plenty of them were being reported above the standard. When we did our back checks, you can see that the distributions are now perfectly match each other, but the auditors were doing much better job at reporting something approximating the truth. And all that happened just by changing the incentives in the auditing market. So now that would be all well and fine, and that's an interesting fact about the world, I think. But the most important thing, I think, is what happened to pollution. The striking finding there is that the plants who now had truthful reports going to the regulator reduced their pollution emissions by almost 30%. And so it is an example of how even in India, where the institutional setting is not very strong, a reformulation of markets, in this case markets for third-party auditing, can really have a first-order effect on air pollution and water pollution. Eventually, this finding was used by the regulator and turned and is now law in the state of Gujarat. Okay, and so let me just close with the last piece of solution. So we talked about policy innovation, now I'm just going to talk about technical innovation. So the math of these fossil fuels is super painful. They're, you know, as long as the world continues not to construct energy markets where social costs are not represented in prices, the fossil fuels look like a good deal. And so is it possible to get the renewables to be more competitive with them? And you know, a first order way to do that is by getting reductions in prices. And here you can see there's been this enormous reduction in solar, improvements in wind, and here's some advances in batteries. But one thing that I touched more briefly, and I just want to underscore, it's not only in the renewables where there's been lots of advances, and here's a little cartoon or picture of how fracking is done, or hydraulic fracturing. And it was really innovative what they figured out how to do. These guys are really brilliant. They drill down like 9,000 feet, then they get the drill to make a 90-degree turn, and only then do they start shooting like sand and fluids into the rocks that cause fissures, and the sand keeps fissures open, and then the natural gas flows out. And this is all done inexpensively. And so the innovation in the fossil fuel sector, it's going to continue. It's remarkable. And in truth, it has provided many benefits for us. So those benefits include, unlocking about 120 years additional of natural gas at low prices, 120 years of global consumption. You can see the world is just getting going on what's possible. Really only the United States and a little bit in Canada and Mexico have started to use hydraulic fracturing, but the reserves are just giant in other parts of the world. Same thing for shale oil resources. And against that, there has really been a pretty sharp decline in support of energy R&D, which is the kind of investments that governments can make to bring new technologies or get renewable technologies to be more competitive. And so I think there's lots of possibilities and potential for increasing funding of basic R&D. All right, and I was going to talk a little bit about geoengineering, but I think we're out of time. So let me just close with a picture of our guy on the bike, and which as I said at the outset, I think very well illustrates the global energy challenge. And just as to repeat myself, that global energy challenge is really constructed of three things. How do we get access to the inexpensive and reliable energy that is going to allow that guy to get off the bike, and that allows the guy in the cab to get off of the bike? How do we do that while controlling or managing the pollution associated with using the fossil fuels that have fueled all that economic growth? And how do we avoid vastly increasing the probability of disruptive climate change? And that's a global energy challenge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. And this is a period of time where we have a question and answer period. And let me introduce Andrew Refkin, who's going to moderate this for us. Andrew is environmental reporter for ProPublica. Prior to that, he was with the New York Times. I think it's probably fair to say Andrew's the most prominent environmental journalist in the country, and we're just delighted that he joined us. And you're like blushing. And I appreciate your volunteering to moderate this. So thank you. Andrew.
I will, but I am going to start out with one question myself, because I'm a reporter. And I guess it's about, some of the things we've talked the last few days about relate to the mix of rational, basic math, economics with a rational man, and then the real world, where this pull of fossil fuels is so profound. The pull of the benefits are there along with the costs. And so I guess when you go to sleep at night or wake up in the morning, what aspect of this doesn't bum you out completely? I mean, you talked about a couple of examples there, but they're kind of still at the margins. We've gone to sleep on R&D.
Yeah.
And the cost of carbon that you helped calculate includes the cost of damages in other countries, which many Americans will never see as are appropriate for us to be integrating, and the cost of future damage, which we always discount the future. And the last part of it is that this is not unique to climate change. I've written a lot about earthquake risk, and I think you're not really in a big-time earthquake zone here, but I've been in some. Istanbul is going to fall down again. It has every 120 years on average. And they're just hoping they're going to, like, their building stock will turn over fast enough so that it'll be a little more robust when the next one comes. So that's the stuff that bums me out. But so where do you find the spark?
Why is this not a depressing talk? I think a lot of these things we have known in a kind of gut sense, and I think what has been missing for a long time has been some reliability and precision and honestly credibility about what the particular numbers were, particularly with the social costs of air pollution and the social cost of carbon. And, you know, the innovation in policy, I think people kind of shook their head a lot of times and said, wow, you know, it's India, it's China, nothing can work. I think we are at the dawn of an era where we can understand so much better what the consequences of these choices are. In principle, those could be fed into policy directly. And I think there's also opportunities to really test new ideas on the policy side that could produce meaningful benefits. And none of that is to take away or be Pollyanna, that like the math is pretty bad, and the political will to implement what is in many respects kind of boring solutions, boring but would be effective solutions, is not always there. But I think, you know, I think the clarity of being able to describe the problem in a clear way, with precision around. I have found that the theory of a number is very different than the number. And so knowing, oh yeah, there's climate damages, but being able to say with some precision what those are, it helps focus people's minds in a completely different way. And you know, just point to one shining example. I think, you know, 5 years ago, could you have imagined that the premier of China would have declared a war on pollution? Like, it seems impossible if you go back to 2012. And, you know, that's happened now. And I think that was partially due to some numbers that people became very uncomfortable with, instead of just a sense of, oh yeah, it's really polluted.
And the emergence of a middle class.
Yes.
Who care?
Yeah.
So there must be some questions on
Hello, I'm Ivan Brzezinski, and you mentioned that coal is not going to disappear, but I've read articles on how coal is at this point becoming so cheap that it's almost not worth it to mine. And I don't know if you would agree with that statement or it's based on false a priori knowledge.
Yeah, I think the hydraulic fracturing revolution has been devastating for coal in the United States, and has greatly reduced coal's share of power production. It's still a primary source in many, many parts of the world, and I don't think coal is going away. Now, it is true as the natural gas starts to get pulled out of the shale rock around the world, that will eat away at coal in other parts of the world too. But you know, the world is still is on track to still use a lot of coal.
And the natural gas moves around now increasingly as well. Europe is, one of the things I reported on earlier this year was when Trump pulled out of Paris, everyone was kind of, okay, Europe, it's all for you to pull your weight now. But at the same time, Europe was meeting with the Trump administration to fast-track exports of U.S. natural gas to Europe. So fracked gas is going from us to Europe, where they won't frack, because they don't want to be beholden on Russia for their gas. It's becoming kind of a...
Where they won't frack currently.
Exactly.
I think the day will come.
Yeah, we'll find out.
Yeah.
More questions? I always have.
It's an occupational hazard for you.
Well, my next question is about academia. What disciplines are not involved that could be more involved? You have this Energy Institute, but is there anything you're lacking there? I'll give you one sense. A few years ago, I was at a meeting talking with someone from the Health and Human Services, Howard Koh, who has testified many times in Congress about public health, the costs of public health. But he said you'll always get at a hearing in the Senate or the House, some congressman will say, or congresswoman will say, well, show me the bodies. You got all these numbers, but... So someone needs to figure out how to visualize public health. What is public health? Is there a way that we're not, graphs work, but maybe numbers and something else? Are the arts involved? What's missing?
Well, my first instinct is the worst instinct. It's like the farmer's instinct about ag subsidies. There should be more, so there should be more economists. Because we're so awesome, but what's missing on the academic side? I'll tell you what's missing. I'm not going to pick on a particular discipline. I think what we're very bad at is finding ways. This is exactly the point, actually, to communicate. We have built these languages that have lots of precision, and they allow us to communicate with each other very efficiently and very effectively. And they make normal people want to pull out their hair. And I think that, in many respects, I think we have failed, or are failing. In, we owe it to the world. These are, amazing jobs. You can sit around and study stuff. And I think you owe it to the world to be able to, what you find when it's useful, be able to describe it. And I think that is not something we're very good at. And if I could change one thing, that's one thing I would change.
The one thing, here we go. Good.
My name is Andrew Davis. I'm a 79 graduate of Beloit. My question is this, and I suspect that you'll reassure me that the calculations have been done properly, but to what extent, when you're weighing the cost of turning human lives into dollars, to what extent are you taking a humanistic point of view as opposed to a sort of a utilitarian Donner Pass, Lord of the Flies view? Which is to say,
Donner Pass is where they hate people, right?
If it appeared from your information, and it certainly makes sense intuitively, that the largest impact is felt by the very young and the very old.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to note that neither of those groups is particularly productive in the classic economic sense.
Okay, so great. I thought you were going to be meaner than you were. I think you think that I'm projecting how much these people are going to earn or are earning. That's not what economists are much more evolved than that. That's what lawyers do. What we do is we look for situations in life where people engage, spend money effectively, to reduce the odds of facing death. So there's all kinds of things like how fast you drive your car, what the wage premium is in jobs that are riskier that people use. And there's been hundreds of studies that take those decisions where people appear to be trading off a little bit of money for a little bit of change in the probability of mortality. You're very lucky. I resist it in including 20 slides on my own paper on this topic. But just to give you a flavor of what we try to do is where I looked at what guys in the military do and when they have an opportunity to sign up again, to re-enlist, and how they trade off bonuses that they get for re-enlisting against the expected mortality rate they place. So it's looking at those kind of trade-offs is the way that people do it.
I have a sort of a granular, small-scale question. I was fascinated by, I would love to know how you found that research opportunity in China. The idea that you had, what do you do as a scholar to look for testable?
Yeah. No, okay, so I've got, at any point in time, I've got 25 questions I would love to know the answer to. Probably 24.9 of them I can't answer in a meaningful way or a way that I find credible. And so I just walk around with them. This Chinese thing, I was trying to get data on mortality in China for years. I didn't really know what I would do with it, but I was really excited about the prospect of having some visibility into what was going on in China. And then I learned about this, arbitrary and capricious policy. Oh, we're going to draw a line across the middle of the country. I was like, whoa, I've been waiting for that one. Yeah.
That's pretty great. So, there's one example I came across. I'm writing an article about cook stoves, and some of the work that he and Rima have been doing. And there's a guy named Sundip Salvi, who's a pulmonologist, runs the Chest Research Foundation in India. He was describing one insight that was gleaned in India about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Most of the science in that is from cigarette smoking and is Western, and no one had really even realized there might be a problem of COPD in developing countries. But one thing they noticed was in India, hardly any women in India smoke. Yet there was a high rate of COPD in women, so you get the same rate of this chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in a population of women and men when women don't smoke. That says something. I thought it was really fascinating.
You know, can I come back to something you raised earlier? About the precision of numbers. So the Indian Minister of Environment and Forests, preceding one who died at an early age, terrible circumstances, was on the record as saying that like the Indian body has developed and evolved in such a way that it is immune to the effects of air pollution. You know, having studies like that one in China, where the air pollution is very similar to India, you know, it makes it much more complicated for guys like that to say things like that. And so I really think, like, you know, we talked about this earlier today, you know, facts and truth are not such a bad thing to be in favor of. And I think they make it hard to pursue policies that, you know, are socially undesirable.
One can hope. There, and then, and there. Now we go. It's like one of those games, you know, an auction.
Hello, my name is Sharon Saley. I'm the parent of a new freshman at Deloitte, and I studied environmental science back at UVA a long time ago. Anyway, my question is, what about, how do economists study the possibility of distributed power, for example, in India or maybe even in Puerto Rico, compared to like distributed power production, small, instead of cook stoves, you know, solar cook stoves or very small solar power, compared to trying to rebuild, you know, a coal-fired power plant with big power distribution. I mean, wouldn't that be something we could study? Like maybe in Puerto Rico right now?
Yeah, so I am actually studying that exact question. From the nature of your question, I suspect you're not going to love the answer. People want what they call real electricity. And they think real electricity is what you can get from solar mini grids. It's not a lot of power, it's unreliable, doesn't work on days it's not sunny, and there's a lot of evidence that it's not hitting the demand very well.
Hi, I'm George Lisinski. I'm a faculty member here. I wanted to ask about the data for wind and solar, because the costs you're putting in there include lithium batteries for the, I mean, you've got, every time you showed wind or solar, you were including battery storage.
I think including natural gas peaker plants instead of lithium.
But
You could have done it either way. The numbers would have been worse with batteries.
okay, so that's my question, because you were showing storage on that. And I think the numbers for wind and solar are better in terms of electricity production cost.
So this is a very important question, and the question is, hey, didn't you cheat and make the wind and solar numbers look bad? Because, and what you have in mind, I think, is like the newspaper articles that say Beloit College just signed a PPA to buy, you know, wind at 2.9 cents a kilowatt hour. I think something like that, right? So you're falling into my trap, so don't nod too quickly. So the problem with that is that contract is absolutely a true contract, but what by installing that wind, it then socializes costs on the rest of the system. And because the wind is intermittent, someone somewhere else is going to have to build a natural gas peaker plant probably to fill in when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And that's why those numbers look larger than what you're used to seeing in newspapers. I tried to account for that.
So taxing pollution instead of taxing something you want people to do makes sense. Problem is, from your graph, a lot of the pollution isn't occurring in the United States. So I wonder if you've considered this. Have a sales tax in the US because we're consuming goods produced somewhere with more pollution. In fact, US consumers would be paying the cost of pollution elsewhere, and that would make goods produced in polluting countries more expensive, and provide, it wouldn't matter what the inspectors said, your goods cost 10% more, there's your incentive to pollute less. Has anyone considered that?
Yeah, so I think when people have thought about having a carbon tax or cap and trade, there was some talk about having kind of border tax, I forget what it's called, border tariff adjustments. Did I have that right? So that the products reflected the carbon content. It's a good idea. It hasn't gained a lot of traction.
I'm Sukanya and I'm a junior. So for a lot of developing countries where the major focus is to improve the standard of living and provide energy to all, what are the implications of asserting clean production and undercarbonization? And have you seen real-life opposition for that?
So sorry, can you repeat the question?
So like for a lot of developing countries where the major focus is to provide energy to all
Yes.
and to improve the standard of living, what would be the implications of asserting clean energy and undercarbonization? And have you ever seen like real-life opposition for that?
Yeah, so I think maybe one way to rephrase that question is, hey, does it really make sense for energy prices to reflect the pollution costs and the carbon costs in places that are really, really focused on increasing access to energy? And the answer is a resounding yes. And the reason it is because that's exactly the place where a lot of the damages are occurring. And so just because the prices don't reflect it doesn't mean that people aren't paying for the high levels of air pollution. They're paying for it with shorter and sicker lives and increasing the probability of really disruptive climate change. So they're not immune from the laws, should I say laws of economics that energy should be priced at full cost. Now, they may place a different value on it, and that's fine.
But let's separate the health costs of the health-related city pollution from the CO2.
Yeah.
Because the developing world has always said, we just spent 100 years burning fossil fuels, adding to the burden in the atmosphere, so at the very least, we owe them a big debt. We should be paying their added cost.
Yeah, so Andrew is going into a very tricky area. And why don't we see the conversation with some extra facts. Like there's only 300 million people in the United States. There's 1.3 or 4 million people in India and China, and our contribution to the stock of GHG in the atmosphere is way larger than China and India, and so doesn't that mean there should be some compensation? My answer to that is maybe there should, maybe there shouldn't. I don't quite know how it would happen, so I'm going to kind of hide behind practical explanations. But none of that really has anything to do with the going forward. And the going forward, there should be I don't think what's happened in the past is relevant to what's going forward. Now, where can I take the idea that you're putting forward is that I want to try and bend that a little bit and say, well, maybe what you're trying to say is that the costs of climate change, that perceived costs of climate change look very different in India than they do in the United States. And why is that? That's because they might discount the future in a very different way. They're very present focused for obvious reasons. They mean consumption today. And having very present focus means they have much higher discount rates. So the same set of climate damages could be valued differently. And so I think what that pushes to it makes it very difficult to have a climate agreement. But I think it might open the door for, if we value it more than they do, transfers to reflect that going forward. And so effectively, that could take the form of, in a global cap and trade markets, which I think seems unlikely, giving them free permits or technology transfer. I think the straight transfer of cash is, death for U.S. politicians. But I think there are ways to reflect that there are different valuations of what's coming, rather than getting into kind of historical questions of justice, which I think are probably above my pay grade.
Yeah, but they also still bring up that we're 17 ton per person per year people, and in India they're 1.9 ton per person people. And there's that equity issue too, even in real time going forward basis.
Yeah.
So.
And this is probably an unsatisfactory answer, but you know what? The planet really doesn't care. Dividing by people. The planet cares about the total number of emissions, the total tons of emissions.
Other questions? A couple more? Yeah.
My name is Dennis. I'm a senior. And you mentioned the sort of line of when it makes more sense to buy a internal combustion engine vehicle and when it makes more sense to buy a battery-powered vehicle. I was wondering if there is a point where batteries will get cheap enough that it makes more sense to have battery backup to solar and wind electric generators as opposed to a natural gas generator.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and you feel to me like, you're America's youth, so you must believe in the bright green future. And the bright green future, the low carbon bright green future, which you've zeroed in on, is super dependent on batteries in a way that I think is not fully penetrated consciousness. And so let me explain why. The first is, until the batteries get cheaper, we're going to use natural gas to back up solar and wind. So it's got kind of mixed carbon content reasons. And until the batteries get cheaper, we're not going to buy electric vehicles. And so the only real way to get low carbon energy into throughout the energy system is through improvements in batteries, because that could green the power sector by dealing with this intermittency in the way you suggested, and then it would allow electric vehicles to become cost competitive. So if you're looking for an energy miracle, which we talked about last night, I'd be pointing my hopes at the battery.
I was just going to ask a quick follow-up question on the solar question. In Wisconsin, the load curve actually has a lot more energy usage during the summer than the winter months. And that's true probably for a lot of states, not probably for like Hawaii and California, a lot of penetration of solar. Do you guys look at that at all and see whether the price is actually different in different parts of the country?
So there's those calculations I did are probably crude and not up to the standards of the Beloit audience. And one reason that is that they're using kind of the average the cost to get it. And the question is, hey, what if solar panels produce at really valuable times, like in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the day, when people are cranking their air conditioners? Then wouldn't that make the calculation look a little bit better for solar? And I'm sure that's true. It's not in the numbers I showed you.
Forget to have you some of that.
I have a question about the prospects for a program like a carbon fee, maybe with like a border adjustment and maybe like with a dividend program in our country, like with the political climate being as it is and like the divisiveness of global warming or talk about climate change and the like power of the fossil fuel industry and like lobbying.
Yeah, so I think, and maybe Andy was getting the same question. What's the positives? What's the scenario where fully pricing energy in a way that reflects carbon costs? How could I see that happening? I think we've got like an outstanding budget problem that we've gotten a little lucky with. The interest rates have been low. And that's kind of hidden it. And the spending cuts that happened after the recession, I think, have were also useful in hiding it. But the aging of the population is, and the entitlement programs, if they stay the way they are going to produce a major budget problem. And my prediction is that it would be very, very hard to cut those programs for the people who are using them at that exact moment in time, and that the government's going to come looking for money at some point. And when it does, I think a carbon tax is going to look a lot more appealing than a lot of other ways of trying to raise revenue. So, I think the positive, how could you feel optimistic about a carbon tax or a cap and trade in the U.S.? I think a lot of that runs through the budget problems.
There are some discussions underway. I think the website is Republican. It's with an E, like Republic EN. It's a sort of a conservative carbon tax. And Citizens Climate Lobby and the Gannon Center. There are people who are working.
There are people out there trying to lay the foundation for that moment. And another proposal that's out there is actually would run counter to solving the budget problem. Would be to just have a carbon tax and never let it enter the government and repay it to households right away. The idea has a lot of merit, I think, and a lot of appeal. Would not solve the budget problem.
So I'm Scott Behrman. I'm a member of the economics department here.
I believe also you have a second job.
So in what direction do you see energy policy going in China and in India? And how would you like to see the United States act to influence those policies?
Yeah, so I think China is, I think, look, they don't really have an energy access problem, at least measured by most developing country standards. I think they're very focused on what I'm calling the second leg of the stool these days, which is air pollution. I think that's terrific. I think there's incredible opportunities for increasing the well-being of Chinese people by focusing on that. And indeed, I think like the first part of regulating air pollution can be, you can get very large gains in the beginning for very low cost. And I think China's focused on that. There's an open question about how they're going to achieve it. They kind of have the engineer's instinct, which is shut it down. And there are much more efficient ways to achieve that. I don't know if they're going to get to those, but so I think that's on the China side. On the India side, I've been working there for a decade, and I've been working with several state pollution control boards and with the state and central kind of departments of energy. They're just really focused on energy access, and you can feel the foundation for more and more outrage about pollution, but they're just not, the country really isn't there right now. And when you have a state of 120 million people living on 130 kilowatt hours per year, I'm not sure, it's probably hard to prioritize pollution. So I think that's going to be their focus for the foreseeable future.
One last thing, one last one. Time scales.
Yeah.
There's a paper I found in the journal Nature from July 1886 about the merits of transitioning from solid fuel coal to gas for cooking. It was in England, and it talks about the merits for London's atmosphere.
Yeah.
In detailed chemistry, exactly what you've been talking about. Less small particle pollution, less piece of fog. 1886, we kind of did it. And then Kirk Smith, the great public health, environmental health guy, we were in India riding somewhere, and he was telling me about the role of public health. And, he's all about urgent. He's about solving this cooking problem. But then he tells me about sanitation. And 150 years, 200 years ago, we learned about the infectious disease roots of fecal contamination and stuff, and he said basically we're still struggling to solve that problem. So do we have to get comfortable with timescales like that? Is this just the way these transitions work?
Well, so I'm going to interpret your question in the same way I interpreted your first question. I'm going to say we're at the dawn of a new era. We're at the dawn of a new era where we can really, with great detail and precision, describe the costs and the benefits of doing different things. And we're beginning to be able to measure that, and we're beginning to be able to provide really reliable evidence on what the benefits of addressing those things are. And, you know, we can describe the political problems as making all of that so that you stay in bed all day, or think that facts and precision about facts can be a useful way to make progress, both in talking to my economist colleagues, but in the real world as well. And so I will end on that more optimistic note that I don't think we're going to have to wait 140 years for that.
Great, so great to have you here.
Let us thank